רק שאלה, זה יהיה יותר קל אם אני אדבר באנגלית? שאלה, כי אני פשוט מסתכל ואני רואה שאנשים לא כל כך מבינים אותי, אז אני... It would be better if I speak in English?
Yes.
Okay. So about the writing process, I think that a story usually it begins with some kind of emotion that you feel, and that you find yourself unable to share it with other people. I can give you an example. You know, one day I was supposed to go to a meeting, and I was waiting in a bus station, and there was a guy there, and he had coffee in a disposable cup, you know, in a plastic cup, and a newspaper, and he had the newspaper under his arm, and when he came to drink from his coffee, the newspaper fell. So he bent down, he put the newspaper again, and he came to drink again, and the newspaper fell. And basically did this a few times, and about the third or fourth time I felt this kind of great sadness, you know. I almost cried, I didn't know, it was very emotional. And when I saw my wife, I told her I saw the most sad thing in the world, the saddest thing in the world. And I told her the story that I saw this man, that every time he would drink coffee the newspaper would fall, and he put it again and he drink and it would fall. And my wife said to me, there's nothing sad about it. If there are starving kids, you know, in Africa, it's sad, but this guy is just stupid. He can put a newspaper somewhere and drink the coffee and it will not fall. And I think that these are the kind of moments that you want to sit down and write, you know, because writing basically through the plot and the story, you can create a bridge between your feelings and the word. And in the end, maybe make people feel and experience the emotions that you had. So I think that writing for me always begins with some kind of a problem. You know, if I can communicate everything, if I can speak to people that they totally understand me, there is no need to write a story. Story is always kind of the plan B. It's the kind of taking the detour to get to the reader's mind and heart when I can take a straight road there. Usually when I write stories, they're fiction, so, you know, many times, you know, they can be fantastical, not realistic, or in any case, not talk about experience that I really had. They're always connected to an experience, but they're not the experience itself. But there is one book that I've published, which is called The 7 Good Years, which basically talks about the 7 years between the birth of my son and the death of my father. And it's a little bit like a memoir or a diary in which I try to process all those kind of things, because I think that sometimes when you go through your life, maybe strange things can happen, but you know, you just don't think about them because you're late to school, you have to, you know, do your homework, you want to meet a friend, and even if you see a lion walking down the street, you know, 5 minutes later, you won't be thinking about it. So there's something about writing that helps you create some kind of a punctuation mark, or, you know, or underline something. So for example, the book begins with the birth of my son. My son was born the day of a terrorist attack. So when we came to the hospital, all the doctors in the maternity ward that's supposed to deliver babies were in the ER taking care of the wounded people. So when I came with my wife, there was no doctor to deliver the baby. And I had to find a doctor. And by the time I arrived with the doctor, my wife's contraction stopped. Like, she was about to give birth, but suddenly it stopped. And I couldn't help thinking to myself that maybe the baby thinks, maybe I should stay inside, it's better. People outside, they kill each other and they're very aggressive. I don't want to be born. And the baby was in her belly 24 hours before it agreed to come out. So there's something about this that you know that when you go through the motion, you know, your son is being born, you take him home, you go to work, but I wanted to write to me all those kind of landmarks, you know, in my biography and history, so I'll be able to remember them. And it's a very different my other books, because people who read it would not know a lot about my parents, my family, my friends. So as a writer, I'm very obsessive about words and meanings. So I apologize for my obsessiveness in advance. But you mentioned two terms. One of them was sad, and the other was not optimistic. Let's say pessimistic. And those two things are totally different. I actually think that my stories are optimistic and sad. I think that the connection between optimistic and sad, for me, is an obvious one. Why? Because if you're optimistic, you believe that things can get better. If you believe that things that can get better and they don't get better, you become sad. Usually, if you're pessimistic, there's nothing to be sad about, because you think in advance that things are going to not go well. I think that my protagonists, they're always incurable optimists. They always believe that things can be good. They always believe that people can be good. They always believe that things can get changed. And in that sense, many times they're disappointed by life. And this creates an effect of sadness. But the fact that they're sad doesn't make them in any way pessimistic, or at least the way that I read them. Now, you said, why do I choose to write sad stories? And I think that that when you sit down and you write a story, you don't say, will I write something sad, will I write something happy, will I have a pizza today, will I go for a hamburger? There is something mimetic in the process of writing. You try to imitate something that you feel in life. Now, I think that usually the more difficult and sadder incidents are the ones that makes you want to write. Because when everything goes well and when you're happy about everything, then you don't have a need to write. I always say to my students that if you look for love poems through history, the most beautiful and the most famous love poems are the ones that people wrote for people who did not love them back. And for me, there's obvious reasons for that, because if you love somebody and that person loves you back, you're too busy to write a poem. You're with the person that you love. But if that person walks away and you're left with your yearning and your wishes, this is when you basically want to write. I think that there is something in writing that it could be a way of reflecting on something that had happened that was difficult. It could be maybe even some kind of a criticism that you want to share with the reader. It could be some kind of a plan B to reach somewhere. But I think that in the bottom line, I'm speaking about my stories in a very subjective manner. Readers can read them differently. I think that there are always some kind of an ambiguous emotion in them, because they're both sad and funny. There are things that do not work, but still people who show compassion. Like the story of Breaking the Pig, there is some sad elements in it, but at the same time, there is a kid who's able to save his story. There is a story about friendship that is able to prevail. There are also positive emotions in this framework, because again, when you write, you want to portray life, and I think that most of the time, life is not just sad or just happy, but it's kind of a mixture of both. Well, I must say that as a writer, the biggest compliment, or the thing that makes me happiest, is if somebody takes a story of mine and tries to adapt it to another medium. It could be just somebody who tries to illustrate the characters in the story. It could be somebody who makes a movie. It could be somebody who creates a graphic novel or a comic book. Because I think that the thing that makes me most content, if I know that there was something in my creation that made other people create too, that it inspired creativeness. And it's funny, but not in Israel, because in Israel and widely read, but there are some places where I don't have many readers, and there I'm always considered an artist's artist, or a writer's writer, which means that most of the people who connect to my work and read it are people who are artists themselves. I think that this has to do also because of the fact that I deal a lot in my stories in a reflexive way, in a somewhat postmodernic way, about the question of why do we write a story? Why do we need to communicate with people? What is the role of art? And all those issues are issues that interest artists. When it comes to these graphic adaptations of the Mexican artists, it was a huge compliment, and I really loved the works that they've made. I also think that because I write very, very short stories, like like the one about breaking the pig, then there are not that many descriptions in my story. Because let's say when you listen to the story, it wasn't mentioned how the father looks like, how the child looks like, what neighborhood they live, how their apartment looks like. And actually when somebody comes to adapt, this is an advantage, because an adaptation is the meeting point between a text and the person who's adapting it. And the fact that a person can know that his adaptation will be different than another person's because he imagines things in a different way, and the story gives him enough space to go to that direction, is something that actually artists like. I can tell you that I have a story called Crazy Glue, and it's a story about a couple that is about to break, and at some stage they kiss and they have crazy glue on their lips and they stay stuck to each other. Now this story was adapted to 2 short movies. One of them was a romantic comedy and the other was a horror movie. And I think that I like this kind of position where you offer the reader a story and you say, you can bring something on your own. It's like if I have, I don't know, concentrated juice, you can add water to it, or you can add aqua con gas to it, or you can add alcohol to it, and a different drink will become out of it. But the fact is that always when you read a story, you're collaborating on the story with the writer. It's not like a movie, because always when you read a story, you imagine the voice of the character, you imagine the words. And I like to, in my collaborations with the readers, I like to give the reader as much space as he or she needs to put a lot of themselves into the story and to see it in many different ways and offer to it many different interpretations. Well, it's very difficult to ask somebody, why work is popular, It's like, if I ask you why do people like you, then it's this kind of thing that you're very happy about, but usually you're the last person, to know the answer. I think that at least in Israel, the thing that had helped me a lot, reach a lot of readers, was the language I've used. I use a colloquial speech, slang, like street talk. My characters sometimes speak in such a way that they make mistakes in grammar. They do not speak in a way, the way that our teachers would want us to speak. They sometimes not very articulate. And I think that in Israel, when I began writing, there was a tradition to write in a very high register. The Hebrew language is the language of the Bible, and when we write a book and we put it on the bookshelf, we know it will be next to the Bible. So when you write in such a holy language, I think the default is really to write in a beautiful language. With me, I was always attracted to the street talk because there's something about the Israeli identity that it's a very complex identity because we're ancient people, but a very young country. And this is something that you can really feel when you speak slang or when you speak the street talk, because if I speak to a taxi driver, in Israel, then most of the things I say, if Abraham or Isaac or Moses would be in the room, they would get them. They would be able to understand them. But at the same time, because the biblical language was spoken and written 2,000 years ago, there are many new words that that do not exist in the ancient Hebrew, because Abraham didn't speak in a microphone or drank mineral water or took the bus here. So what happened in the street talk is that people use this ancient language, but all the time they have to invent and import new words that did not exist in the Bible to communicate. And I really like the tensions that this creates in the sentences, because every sentence you write is half biblical, but 20% American and maybe 50% Russian. And this mixture is something that really shows the inner tension in the Israeli identity, that we are people who are both conservative and religious, but also liberal and open to other cultures, and almost subversive and anarchistic in the way that we see the world. So when I started writing in this language, I know that many of my readers who felt a little bit alienated when they read books that were written in a high register Hebrew, connected first and foremost to the fact that they could read a story that sounded to them the way that a friend would speak to them, and not in a way that a teacher would speak to them. And I think that this is one of the reasons, at least in Israel, why I find myself many readers. Story called Siren, and in this story there is a Holocaust survivor who is the father of one of the children in school, who comes and speaks on the stage, and the question was if that Holocaust survivor was based on my father. So, not at all. My father was a child during the Holocaust, and many young people who came to Israel and who were Holocaust survivors tried to integrate as quickly as they could and pass for sabras. I think that the Holocaust survivors, especially young ones, they didn't see a lot of pride in telling that they came from this hellish place. The Israeli society was actually very critical, in a sense intolerant to Holocaust survivors. Many times they would insult them. They would say, if we Sabras, we were the Holocaust, we would fight. My mother told me many times that people told her, you survived because you must have been a collaborator with the Nazi or a prostitute, In Hebrew terms, if a nickname for somebody who's not good at sport and who's, doesn't have a son, then we call him in Hebrew slang, Sabon. Sabon is soap bar. The reason that you call people like this soap bar was because this was the nickname for Holocaust survivors. So my father never wanted to take this kind of position of a Holocaust survivor. I think that most of my friends in school did not know that he went through the Holocaust, and the guy in the story is somebody I just invented. Maybe I can say something general about an adaptation. That they made quite a few adaptations to my works, for films, TV, graphic novels. There is one adaptation that I especially like. It's based on my book, הקייטנה של קנלר. It's called Pizzeria Kamikaze in Spanish. And this was an adaptation that was made in the US, in which one of the lead actors is the singer Tom Waits, who's a singer I like a lot, and it's a beautiful film. What I want to say about adaptations is that, let's say in this adaptation, the director changed the end of the story. And many times I meet people who saw the film and they say, chutzpah, this is not very nice, it's not correct, how can you change your story? But I think that it's very, very important in an adaptation not to be loyal to the story, but to be loyal to yourself. If you're somebody who wants to create an adaptation, I think that you should say I should have everything in the story also in the movie, because this would be like faxing the page of the story to the screen. You should say, how can I use the story to tell what interests me? One of my favorite film adaptations ever is a film called Apocalypse Now. Apocalypse Now is based on a book of Joseph Conrad called Heart of Darkness. Now, the book Heart of Darkness takes place in Africa in the early 20th century. When they adapted it to Apocalypse Now, it was done by people who went through the Vietnam War. When they read this book, it took place in a different continent and in a different context. It's basically a story about missionaries going to Africa. They said this was exactly how we felt when we entered the jungle in Vietnam. So they basically took the story, put it in different setting, changed many things in it, but at the same time I think it's a very loyal adaptation, because its loyalty is to the feeling of a reader when he reads this book. So when I see adaptations, based on my stories, I can say I like it or I don't like it, or if it's good or if it's bad. But the last thing that interests me, if the adaptation is very, very close to the original story, I think the adaptation can go very far from the story, as long as it can keep something of its essence. So I started writing during my compulsory army service. In Israel, you have to go to the army for 3 years. And one of the most difficult things for me in the army, as you see, I'm somebody who talks a lot. And in the army, whenever you talk, you get into trouble. So many times when I would speak about my emotions, my feeling, my wishes, I would understand that it's a mistake. And I think that at some stage, writing kind of exchange speaking, because when you write on a piece of paper and you can show it to the people that you want. And I think that in the army many times, you were a soldier, you wear a uniform, you have a short haircut. And for me, the writing was very important at that time, because it reminded me who I really was. That I pretended to be a soldier, but that I was afraid, I was in love, I wanted all those kind of things. So I think it's not coincidence that I discovered writing in a time where I really felt that I couldn't be myself, in the real world, so I wanted to keep something of myself in writing.